China's killing our canola. $45 billion gone. Western farmers bleed. Mark Carney? Silent. Made millions off Beijing's dime. He won't fight. He's Beijing's banker, not our prime minister.
Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Folks, we have 4 more days until the election, until Canadians decide their fate. And I wanted to spend the show today talking about what has happened in Canada over the past decade, really paint a picture of our country, which I believe is in decline. You know, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, one of their slogans is that Canada is broken. I think that almost all of us agree with that. But it's not just that it's broken. It's that Canada was this once great country, and we have the potential to be so much better, so much bigger, so much greater. And yet, stat after stat, every graph that I'm going to show on the program today just paints a different picture of our great country coming apart, being in decline. And so I don't want to just dwell on the negative today. I want to also talk about the positive and how we can turn things around. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by Brett Wilson. Brett is an investment banker, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. And he was the star of CBC's Dragon Den, really did more for entrepreneurship and promoting really just the heroic efforts of free market business people taking risks, innovating, exactly what our country needs. So, Brett, thank you so much for joining the show. It's an honor to have you today.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Well, okay, let's start with some of the things that I was talking about here. So I'll start with our friend David Knight-Legg posted this about the quality of life index in Canada. So Canada is now ranked 29th in terms of quality of living. Here I'll read from David's post. He says, we're 29. Under the Conservative government in 2014, Canada's quality of life index was tied for 5th with Denmark and Finland. After a decade of Liberal misrule, using the identical metrics, Canadian quality of life has dropped to 29th in 2025. What happened? Well, he writes, a Carney-advised decade of reckless borrowing and debt, dying productivity, overregulation, climate alarmism, widespread immigration fraud, vastly expanded obese bureaucracy, declining healthcare, rising crime, declining military, declining infrastructure, and a hollowed-out currency. Our dollar is now worth 68 cents to the American dollar per capita. Wealth is now ranked alongside Mississippi, the poorest U.S. state. So, I mean, he really paints out all of the areas of decline. And I mean, the quality of life index is not a partisan group. It's very quite objective. It looks at every country around the world. Do you think this is just really a damning indictment of Liberal rule in Canada?
Well, certainly the last decade's been difficult. There's just no policy, no practice, no effort that I see in any way, shape, or form that has made Canada better. So the fact that, again, I go back to the polls in the fall, obviously the Trudeau Liberals were plummeting. You know, the numbers were just awful. And it was obvious that Canada's disdain for Trudeau was palpable. The fact that a guy, happen to like Mark Carney as a person, not as a leader, but the fact that he stepped back in and all of a sudden the Liberals are going, oh, everything's fine. We're going to be okay. And you look at the cabinet that he's posted, 21 of the 23 people, in fact, really all 23, were Trudeauites. There's nothing new happening. Guilbeault got moved over. He was one of the guys that helped destroy Canada's energy economy, or tried to, and is working on it. But he's sort of stepped to the side, but he's still in cabinet. He's not gone. And so to try and answer your question better, the future requires change. And the fact that somehow with Carney in the driver's seat, the Liberals think that there's going to be change, there's no change. Nothing. And again, the results of the last decade have been awful on every level, whether it's politics or it's bureaucracy or it's prisons or it's the economy. Nothing has gone well. Nothing.
I tend to agree that we need a total redirection in terms of where our country is going. Just a few more graphs that I wanted to share here. So this one here shows America's richest and poorest states versus Canada. So this is really unbelievable. The richest American state, I don't like this at all, Brett. The richest American state is Washington, D.C., which isn't really a state, it's a district. But the average income in D.C. is $260,000. I don't think that's a good thing when the richest place in the country is the government town. And so you have all these wealthy, I don't know, government contractors or bureaucrats, frankly. But regardless of that, the second richest state is New York State with $110,000 as their GDP per capita average. Then goes Massachusetts. The U.S. average is 80,000 U.S. dollars. And then you get down to the poorest U.S. states, Arkansas, West Virginia. And that is where Canada would fit in. Canada would be between the second poorest and the poorest American state, between West Virginia and Mississippi, at just $54,900 average GDP. This is another way of looking at that. The real GDP per capita growth in the OECD. So these are the richest countries, not just comparing ourselves to Americans in the States, but all of the world. You can see Ireland, Poland, Turkey, Lithuania. Those are the countries that have had tremendous growth over the past decade. The United States is sort of middle of the pack with 18%. And you have to go all the way to the bottom. The second to least growth, 1.4% over a decade for a GDP per capita. This is the next graph is showing the same thing, just in a different way. Again, Canada is at the bottom. And these are the years that the Liberals were in office. These are the years that Trudeau was prime minister. And for many of those years, Mark Carney was his economic advisor. Final one here. This is, to me, just an absolute damning indictment of our immigration system and how careless it was. You know, like, immigration in theory is a good thing. It can help our country. The way that it was done under Justin Trudeau was really just open the floodgates, let everybody come in to try to artificially boost our GDP. And so here it compares the annual population growth with the top graph here, the number of new residential units constructed. No wonder there's a housing crisis. And it's a shame that this hasn't been a more prominent topic in the election campaign, how immigration has caused so many of these problems. You cannot let 1 million people into the country every year and then only build 100 or 200,000 new homes. Like, the math just doesn't add up, and eventually it catches up on you. The next graph is also interesting. Annual population growth in Canada versus the change in number of family doctors and hospital beds. So while we're having 1 million newcomers, I mean, in 2022-23, we added 2 million people, but at that same year, there were just 800 new doctors, 800 new family doctors added in the country, and 1,359 hospital beds were cut during that time. So, you know, no wonder our healthcare is in the state it's in. No wonder our housing costs are spiraling out of control, and young Canadians just simply, the math doesn't make sense for them to ever in their entire lives be able to own even a 1-bedroom apartment. And yet, you know, it's clearly part of it is because of immigration, and we don't talk about that. What do you make of all this, Brett?
Well, certainly the feds don't want to talk about immigration. I mean, there's also a bias. There's a perception that there's a possibility or a probability that an immigrant will vote for whoever was in power when they were allowed into the country without true application, without true qualification. And that, I think, is the saddest part of this whole process, because I share one of your earlier comments, which is we welcome the world coming here, but on a thoughtful, organized, and respectful basis. And right now it's been none of the above, not thoughtful, not organized, and not respectful. And that's a big part of why we're suffering. And of course, the density increases in Ontario and Quebec because there's greater populations and everything else. And it just doesn't make sense. The other thing that's happening is obviously a fight and a dispute between what the feds do for Medicare or healthcare and what the provinces do when they're responsible for healthcare. The confusion just abounds. And at no time did Trudeau ever acknowledge that provinces have rights, provinces have responsibility. The things he was trying to do, and just take ESG as an example, for the environment, you know, trying to slap the provinces, and that's obviously in particular Alberta, to a lesser degree Saskatchewan, have said, we're going to push back and we're going to try and stop you from attempting to shut down our economy. And that goes back to the big picture: is, can Carney build Canada? And he says yes. And then he says, but Bill C-69, we're just going to keep that in place. We don't really need to waive that in order to build infrastructure. And again, the idea that that Poilievre has come out with very recently, and it's an old idea, but it's new to the world of politics. And that's the energy corridor, being able to bring energy. And again, it's not just east-west. We need an energy corridor that is north-south. We need to be able to get to Hudson Bay. We need to get down into the States properly. Anyway, there's so much that's wrong about the last decade that it's staggering, if not stunning, that Carney can pretend that the next decade under him would be completely different.
Well, it's interesting because he both tries to distance himself from Trudeau and say that he wasn't there, even though, to your point, he has the same group of people around him. I think Polyev effectively pointed that out during the debate. And in some ways, they're copying the conservative platform. Like the main issue of the debate originally, of the election, sorry, it originally was going to be, will we have this carbon tax or not? Obviously, the Liberals championed it for a decade. It's very central to Mark Carney's sort of worldview and idea that getting to net zero is of absolute importance. He sort of walked away from that. This week, they both campaigns, the Liberals and the Conservatives, put out their costed budgets. And, the top line is sort of both sides want to introduce new spending and rack up more debt. Neither of them have a plan to get to balanced budget in the first term. I will say that Polyev's campaign and platform included a 70% reduction in spending compared to Mark Carney, who does still want to turn on the taps and spend in a Trudeau-esque way, actually spending more money than Trudeau did. I wonder if you can comment on which budget you thought was better and which one do you think would be better in creating the growth that our country so desperately needs?
Well, let me throw a curve at that question first, and that's just to comment on Trump, which was obviously a huge part of what's driving the political conversations right now. And again, I know some people hate me for this, but I happen to admire what Trump's trying to do. Again, protect the borders, improve trade, reduce war, improve the environment properly and thoughtfully. Anyway, all of that is a noble goal. I don't like his process. I don't like how he's going about it, throwing his elbows, changing his plan, kicking us in the teeth from time to time. His 51st state jokes are gone. Governor Trudeau was amusing for a period of time. But anyway, in all of that, there's a thought that we can control costs. And one of his core messages was the Department of Government Efficiency, obviously the Elon Musk. And whether Canada can find its own way of cutting costs or not, I think only under Pierre Poilievre can we do anything about costs. At no time, and this goes back to answering your question, Carney hasn't made any effort whatsoever. The Liberals have made no effort whatsoever to talk about controlling costs. Remember, their leader once said that budgets just balance themselves. He didn't have a clue. And obviously, at this point, they don't care. They just want to spend. They want to spend their way into control. They want to gift and give stuff everywhere. And that's without infrastructure. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we're seeing. And again, it's triggered by Trump, but the fact that we need infrastructure to move our natural resources, and whether you call our natural resources the hydropower of Quebec or the oil and gas industry in Western Canada, or potassium or uranium, it just doesn't matter. There's so many things that we can do better for the world, but we need infrastructure to ship it to the world. And that's where the Liberals for a decade have failed miserably. They've shut it down. They haven't even tried to build it. They've shut it down.
Well, it's interesting that at this point in the campaign has been going on for 5 weeks. Mark Carney has been in the prime minister role for, I guess, 7 weeks now. And yet I don't even really know, Brett, where he stands on the issue of pipelines. You're right. He said that he won't get rid of Bill C-69, which is the No More Pipelines bill, basically. The regulations make it so much that you can't get an infrastructure project built. In the debate last week, he oddly misspoke and said that we own the Keystone pipeline, which, of course, is not a pipeline that was even completed. It's the one that goes into the United States and brings Alberta oil to refineries in Texas. It is partially built, but it's not fully built. And I think he meant to say the Trans Mountain pipeline. He said in English earlier in the campaign, in a campaign stop in Kelowna, that he will use all of the powers of the federal government to get major infrastructure projects like pipelines built. He said that he would even use the emergencies power. He was called out on that at the debate by Bloc leader Yves Francois Blanchet, and he kind of like tried to walk over it and hand wave it away. And so here we are almost at election day, and I really don't know where the leader stands in terms of pipelines. Alberta wasn't mentioned very much during the campaign. It wasn't mentioned at all, to my recollection, during those two debates. And so I'm wondering, like, from an Alberta perspective, do you think that these issues have been properly litigated in the public? Do you think that more should have been done to discuss these issues of economic development and growth and really grill the leaders to find out exactly where they stand on these issues?
Well, the federal government, which is liberal, still has an emissions cap contemplated for the energy industry. And that's obviously been one of the greatest issues that Danielle Smith and Scott Moe have fought back. They've thrown elbows saying, and partly, when we introduced in Alberta what was called the Sovereignty Act, it was to make sure that we understood as a nation who could control what. And at this moment, the liberals think they can control everything. And it's that infrastructure failure that's a problem. By the way, a bit of history. I had the privilege of having dinner with Pierre Poilievre 12 or 13 years ago. I met him with a dinner we were doing with John Baird, had a great conversation, and have stayed friends with him ever since. I also had lunch with Mark Carney the week before he was elected by the Liberals. And he was he was running around in Calgary, and he knows I've got a few connections here. And we had a great conversation about infrastructure, and he was adamant, looked me in the eye and said, I'm certain that we can build pipelines. And then a week later, he says, we're not going to restrict Bill 69. So the fact that C69 kills pipelines and he doesn't want to kill it tells me the Liberals are still confused as to what infrastructure really means. So no, I'm all in on Poilievre. I'm all in on this idea of energy infrastructure, and not just energy, natural resource infrastructure, being able to ship what we are great at. And again, it goes back to the big picture: potassium, agriculture, farming, trees, coal. I mean, we still ship coal. And by the way, we've been shipping coal to China for a decade, and not once have we ever charged a carbon tax on it. And yet, let's be clear, Liberals still plan to keep the carbon tax in place. The bulk of the carbon tax was never explained. This idea that there was a credit, they lied about the numbers. Now they've said, oh, we're going to stop the carbon tax. That's just to get elected. There's going to be a twist, a turn. They aren't planning on eliminating the carbon tax. Why? Because Carney doesn't believe that the world will survive without a carbon tax.
Certainly.
He's been crystal clear on that.
It's so core to his worldview, his ideology. It's written very clearly in his book, Values. I mean, he was the sort of creator of this concept of net zero, and that whole concept has kind of gone away. Like, it's interesting that Mark Carney gets kind of accused of being elitist. At one point in the campaign, he said he is a globalist and an elitist, and that's why he should get elected, basically. He came from the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum isn't really anything without him. And I think evident of that is the fact that Klaus Schwab has now resigned from that organization. And I think that without those two figures, Mark Carney and Klaus Schwab, it doesn't really exist anymore. The whole ideology is fading away. I think Mark Carney had a bit of a campaign gaffe. That's what I would call it. Earlier this week, he went to a poutine shop near Granby, Quebec. And he said that he was just like Trump. And he joked several times that it was like Trump at McDonald's. I don't know why he would compare himself to Trump during the last week of the campaign. I think maybe he was joking and he thought it was funny. This isn't really the comparison that you want going into election day. Like, look at me, I'm going to do a photo op just like President Trump did. I thought that when President Trump did it, it was quite charming, and that actually really helped his appeal, that he actually kind of likes getting into the role of like being with the American public, working a working class job. He thinks there's dignity in it. I didn't get that from Mark Carney at all. I felt like it was just kind of awkward, and literally their entire campaign attack ads in this campaign have been Poilievre. Look at Poilievre, he's just like Trump. And then here's Carney saying, I'm just like Trump. At the end, what do you think of Carney as his ability to campaign and his ability to connect with everyday Canadians?
Well, that's been a bit of frustration. I think what's happened is that Carney is so much more connectable than Trudeau. And so his benchmark is so low that it's easy to make him look better than the last guy. And yet a thoughtful comparison would say, has this guy ever held a hammer or a screwdriver? Has he ever actually built anything of relevance for anything other than himself? I mean, Brookfield's obviously doing well. I mean, you saw the messages that came out of the president or the Prime Minister of England, whatever her title was. I'm sorry.
Liz Truss, I think you're talking about.
But her disdain for her Bank of Canada guy was palpable. And so if he hasn't really delivered on anything at any time, anywhere, but he still looks better than Trudeau. And again, that's the bizarre part here is Trudeau had developed such a disdain, or the Canada had developed such a disdain for Trudeau. It was across all platforms. It didn't matter where he started. And the numbers, but again, let's go back to polling. The polling obviously was very clear that at one time, the disdain for Trudeau drove the Conservatives up and the Liberals down. You get rid of Trudeau and now all of a sudden the Liberals rally. I'm openly skeptical that the polling is accurate. As a friend of mine said, my kids don't answer the phone, but they do vote. And so again, it'll be interesting to see where all of this unfolds. I'm apprehensive. I'm worried that we're not going to be thoughtful as a nation, because any thought at all says the last decade has to be replaced.
It's time.
Not upgrade.
It's time
replaced.
Sorry to interrupt you. It certainly feels like it's time for a change, and it's frustrating to me that some Canadians think that Mark Carney has changed enough, that he, because his face wasn't all over, he wasn't part of the Trudeau cabinet. It's interesting though, because Pierre Poilievre gets critiqued for being a lifelong politician. Well, Mark Carney's a lifelong bureaucrat, right? And so those are two kind of different skill sets. Yes, Mark Carney ended up being the chair of Brookfield. Brett, you're a businessman. You know that there's a difference between being the CEO of a company, where you're in charge of actually running the business and doing the operations, and being on the board, which Mark Carney was on the board of several of these organizations, and he was the chair of the board of Brookfield, which is almost like an advisory role or like a PR role. It's not someone who is actually running the business. It's someone who's almost like in just some kind of an outside role that helps with the leadership team and helps make decisions. So I don't really see, I suppose on the surface it is a very impressive resume, even just, Harvard, Oxford, these big bank government jobs. But again, civil service. And then when it comes to private sector, it's more like he's just there for the PR.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
He's got that same presence in terms of how he's running the Liberal Party. Mm-hmm. He's present. But it's also obvious now that he's presenting a standard, a set of rules and guidelines that was built by Trudeau's people, not by him. He's presenting the Liberal platform.
Right. And so I wonder, just from like a businessman, like entrepreneurial perspective, like, do you share my pessimism about Canada? Do you think it's broken? Do you think that there's hope? Like, is Canada just on this trajectory of decline that no matter who's in charge, it's sort of too late for us? Or do you think that there are a set of policies that can turn Canada into, like, can give this new generation, like 20-year-olds today, the same kind of opportunities that were available for previous generations? Can Canada get itself back up in that comparison so that our average GDP per capita is in line with the Americans? Or do you think that it's sort of like too late? What do you think?
Well, there's several conversations that erupt here. One, I am not going to be participating actively in trying to have Alberta removed from Canada. I have no interest in Alberta being associated as, call it, the 51st state. Now, do we need to do things differently? Yeah. I mean, the confusion of letting the Liberals grow our economy when they've destroyed it for 10 years is palpable. And the idea of building infrastructure and getting our natural resources to a global market makes sense. We need to manage our immigration. We need to manage our bureaucracy. And that's where, again, the Department of Government Efficiency should drive down costs in a dramatic fashion. The fact that we've doubled our bureaucratic headcount in the last 10 years, doubled? No, none of that makes any sense. So again, I get really apprehensive about a liberal, even a liberal minority government, with the swing being either Bloc, who I don't think should be running as a federal party, but that's a separate issue, or the NDP, who don't offer anything. They just they get sold. They're buying votes. They're buying alignment. They, again, ignore the NDP. But no, I'm apprehensive. I'm extremely apprehensive about what's going to happen next week if the Liberals wander into a continuous mode. The economy, we can regrow it. We can rebuild it. We can get things going. But we can't do it under a liberal platform.
Well, it doesn't seem like they've really put together a picture of growth. Their entire campaign was really just oriented around who can stop Trump, who can be the most anti-American, who can better sort of balance that out, rather than who can best grow the Canadian economy, which I think is the ballot box question. Well, Brett Wilson, we really appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you so much for joining the show. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Look forward to chatting again.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. That's all the time we have for today, folks. We'll be back again tomorrow with all the news. Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you and God bless.